Okay, everyone's signing in. I'm gonna give it a couple seconds. We start seeing all the numbers going up. We're up to 200. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and start, and the other participants can join in at their leisure. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and welcome. For some of you, it's late at night. For some others, it's early morning. Regardless of time, we're very grateful that you're here with us, joining us today at this webinar. We're all here because we share the same common interest, and that is online child protection. My name is Guillermo Galarza. I am the Director of International Law Enforcement Trainings at the International Center for Missing and Exploited Children. First of all, it is a tremendous honor to be here with you today to facilitate these important discussions for those of you working in the field of child protection. On behalf of the International Center for Missing and Exploited Children and our global partner, UNODC, United Nations of Drugs and Crime, we would like to welcome you to this webinar where we're going to discuss a very important issue, and that is online child protection around this pandemic time. Over the next few months, more than ever, children will be at home. Children will be accessing the internet. Children will be playing video games and playing mobile applications. The question is, are they safe? Are we doing enough to protect them? Who are the victims? What are the challenges for us and for law enforcement and society to protect them? As we're all trying to couple with this new pandemic, the reality, ladies and gentlemen, is here, and it's going to be here for a couple of months. This webinar aims to bring clarity to generate discussions around these areas. With that in mind, I'd like to introduce our panelists or speakers, and I want to call them friends because I believe they're good friends. Our first speaker is going to be Mr. Neil Walsh. He's the Chief of Cybercrime, Anti-Money Laundering, and Counter-Financing of the Terrorism Department at the United Nations of Drugs and Crime. Welcome, Neil. The first speaker is John Rouse. The second speaker is John Rouse, Manager of the Covert Online Victim Identification and Training of the Australian Centre to Counter Child Sexual Exploitation, Australian Federal Police. And we have Ramanjot Kaur, mental health professional, who I have not met, and I am really looking forward to meeting her soon. A few house rules for this webinar. We have about 60 minutes for this webinar, now more like 57. We will do our best to be to the point and to be brief. As usual, we encourage contribution and participation on this webinar. When Neil speaks or the other speakers are presenting, please put your questions on the right-hand corner in the chat box, and we will try to address them either during the presentation or at the end. We will have 15 minutes for Q&A at the end of the seminar. Please start writing your comments, suggestions, and questions again in the box. All in all, we have about 460 participants that have joined us today. Some of you are joining us in groups. Thank you so much for doing that again. As a reminder, this call will be recorded. We might, I said we might share it, I don't know, depending on how we go. This will open another opportunity for another webinar. With that said, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our first speaker. Neil, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Guillermo. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everybody. I'm Neil Walsh, and I'm speaking to you from Vienna in Austria. So it really is my honor and our pleasure to be able to join you today. And this is a topic that gets to the heart of what we do. At my organization, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, what we do is give training, capacity building, and the capability to cops, prosecutors, and judges around the world to investigate and counter online child sexual exploitation and abuse. Before I joined the UN a few years ago, similar to John, I worked in policing. John's in Australia, and I was in the UK, in the UK's National Crime Agency. And countering online child sexual abuse is something that really sits in my heart. It is one of the most important things that we will ever be able to do. It has impact straight away. It keeps our kids safe. It has a longer term impact. It stops the harm that is caused by child sexual abuse from propagating throughout the victim's lifetime, throughout their family, and around the world. So everything that we do, and the reason that we're doing this today, is to try and keep people safe, and to try and keep people safe, not just online, but offline as well. And the fact that many of you have taken the time to join us today is fantastic. That tells us a lot, and we appreciate your time. So I want to start by building a broad picture of what we're actually talking about, because sometimes the language that we use can be confusing. Sometimes it can undermine keeping people safe as well. Some of you will have heard the phrase child pornography before, and we don't use that term. In fact, we get away from that term as far as we possibly can. And the reason for that is, if you imagine seeing someone on an adult pornography site, you see consensual adults primarily engaged in porn. If you saw a 4-month-old baby being raped on a live stream broadcast for payment, you would not regard that child as a porn star. You wouldn't use that terminology. So we don't use it either. Some countries, some states have child pornography laws, but we talk about child sexual abuse material, child sexual exploitation material. And that allows us to help to deal with victims and to understand what we're talking about. I want to give you a sense of what the scale of this is, and I think John will speak to this in much greater detail as he has the operational expertise to do that. One of the organizations that UNODC has worked with over the past few years is called the Internet Watch Foundation. The IWF is based in the UK, but it hosts a number of reporting portals around the world, where if people like you or I find or see what we believe to be child sexual abuse material online, we can report it to them. And they are very often able to have that taken down within a matter of hours, sometimes even faster than that. But the scale of it continues to shock. And the IWF produced a report in 2018 that in that period, in that 1-year period, from public reports that had come to them, they had assessed over 100,000 URLs, 100,000 website addresses that were hosting child sexual abuse material. Now, one website can host hundreds, thousands, millions of images or videos or sound clips. So the scale of this is phenomenal. And more so is the harm that is done, and the scale of the harm that we see. Child sexual abuse can mean anything from children from 18 and down. And what we saw, and I'm going to look at the report that I've got on my screen right now, is in 2018, 23% of what the IWF assessed and dealt with involved category A material, which they define as sexual activity between adults and children, including rape or sexual torture. And at the worst end of this, we see babies and pre-verbal infants being raped and sexually tortured. We see this happening as a pay-per-view opportunity, where victims are located in one part of the world and offenders are in the other. And they pay with Bitcoin, they pay with Western Union payments for this harm, for this torture to happen to children. And that's what we're about, is trying to stop this. The scale of this is phenomenal. And I remember some of the casework that I dealt with as a cop. There are things that will stay with me for the rest of my life. Things I wish I'd never seen. Things I wish I could forget. And I can't. But it's nothing compared to what the kids go through around the world. And often we hear from people that they think this is a Western problem or it is a developing country problem. It's not. It's a societal problem. This is a human problem. These are the challenges that we face because kids, no matter which country they're born in, where they grow up, are at risk of this. They're at risk at home, they're at risk in school, in religious groups, in places where children are brought together. And like all areas of crime and criminality, child sexual abusers seek to exploit. They exploit through fear, they exploit through secrecy, and by trying to leverage children and put them under pressure not to speak about what's going on in their lives. And we will all know someone who has been a victim of this. Even if we don't consciously know about their victimhood, we do know people that have experienced this. Some of you watching now will have experienced this. We all might know an offender as well. And this is one of the most difficult things I think that as a society we have to face. Child sexual abusers don't have a profile. It could be a man, it could be a woman. They could be rich, poor, employed, unemployed. It could be me, it could be you. So we can't just build a picture of thinking it's a certain person in a certain part of society. We have to be able to speak openly about this. And we have to enable victims to talk. And the way we do this, the way we have to start with this is by empowering our children. Empowering them to understand about consent at the earliest of ages. I'm an incredibly lucky guy. I've got 4 kids and they're aged 9, 7, 5 and 3. And we started conversations about child sexual abuse from the age of 2 and 3. Now we didn't call it that, right? We didn't call it rape. We didn't call it sexual abuse, but we did talk about what's appropriate. So for example, if one of my youngest was in the shower, I would say, hey, I need to wash your bum. Is that okay? So we've introduced an element of consent. We also talk about our body parts using the correct name. If we get embarrassed, ladies and gentlemen, saying the word penis or vulva or vagina, then we don't help our kids, the people that we have to protect, to understand their own bodily integrity and what they're called. And by helping them to understand their own body parts and what they're called, it helps them to understand and to explain if something goes wrong. A lot of the work that me and my colleagues do, and one of my colleagues, my deputy, Nayeli Loya, is doing a session right after this in Spanish. And I remember that with Nayeli and Pilar, one of our colleagues from ICMEC, we did a presentation in Central America a couple of years ago. And every time we do this, every time we deliver training together, victims come and self-report. And we have to make sure we create an environment where they will be believed. Because if victims aren't believed by police, by prosecutors, by judges, by society, then things don't work. And we have to be able to speak with credibility. We have to be able to speak to each other with honesty to actually understand what this is or what the scale of it. And a lot of the pressure on doing this is on us as parents, as caregivers, whether you're a teacher, a parent, someone looking after kids in an environment that requires their care. You have to understand what this looks like. We have to help them to understand what being groomed might feel like. So when someone is trying to get them into a position that is sexually exploitive. And so much of this happens online, and especially now, we're really concerned that so much of our education has moved online because our kids are at home. So we have to help them to understand in an environment where they understand the technology that they're using. We can't come from a position of saying, hey, you're not using that device, or you've got to sit with me beside me using that device, because I know when my kids are using a tablet, I'm not watching what's on the screen all the time. I don't have the time to be going around the 4 of them at the same time. So we have to change our perspective on this. We have to let them understand what abuse feels like, what coercion feels like, and what some of the challenges that they may face feels like. And we've got lots of resources that I'm sure Guillermo and the ICMEC staff can post after this with hyperlinks that you can look at and take your time to go through this. And before I stop, I want to speak to any of you online who have concerns about your own behavior. If you have found yourself having sexual thoughts about children, if you have found yourself abusing children, we need you to stop. We need you to seek help. And there is help out there. There are organizations like, for example, the Stop It Now campaign and the Lucy Faithfull Foundation and the Australian E-Safety Commissioner's Office, who provide resources for people who are thinking of having sexual contact with a child to reach out for help. This is in your hands to do something about it. It's in all of our hands to do something about it. And the one thing that I can reassure you about is that with United Nations, UNODC, with ICMEC, with law enforcement professionals like John and the Australian Federal Police and mental health professionals like Raman, there is a large network of people working day in and day out to counter this. But the solution is not law enforcement. It is too late when we're investigating. The core message of this is prevention, and prevention starts in the home. It continues in the school. It continues across society. So if you see something that concerns you, if you see a child displaying the signs of what abuse may look like, and I'll ask John probably to speak to that more, please do something about it. Be part of the solution. Don't be a bystander and watch and think that that's awful. Do something about it. If you're on an adult pornography site and you see videos or images that you think are of kids, people under 18, report it. You can report it anonymously through the InHope portals or the Internet Watch Foundation. There are resources out there to report it. You don't have to say who you are or where you are. So I'll stop there and I'll ask you to please be part of the solution, and we're going to take your questions a little bit later on. So thanks for listening. Gigi, back to you, and thanks for your time, everybody.
Thank you so much, Neil. Thank you so much, everyone, for putting some of the questions up on the Q&A section. I will address those questions at the end as well. There's definitely really good questions for you, Neil, but I will get to them at the end as well. We'll go ahead with the next presenter. And again, thank you so much, Neil, for your time. Our next presenter is John Rouse. John, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Gigi. And good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are, whatever you're doing. My name is John Rouse. I'm currently located in Brisbane, Queensland in Australia, where the time now is about 10 minutes to 12 at midnight. I've been a police officer now for 36 years. I've worked in child protection for 20 of those 36 years. My current role is the manager of the COVID online team, the victim identification team, and the training team that's located at the Australian Centre to Counter Child Exploitation. Prior to this, I led a team that was called that still is called Task Force Argos, which is with the Queensland Police Service, and it's a dedicated unit that was set up to specifically counter the issues of technology facilitated crimes against children. So in that 20 years, I've effectively seen the internet progress from a fax modem to where we're sitting right now at fibre. Now, the Australian Centre to Counter Child Exploitation was launched as a result of the current federal government under Minister Peter Dutton. It's, in my opinion, a very comprehensive solution to try to bring the country together to fight this really quite horrendous crime that I've witnessed over the last 20 years of my life. The ACE, where I sit, we have, as I said, we have victim identification, we've got COVID online, we have an intelligence fusion cell, we have evaluations and referrals, we've got a research working group, a prevention education team, and fundamentally critical to a lot of that is our triage cell that manages a lot of things like the cyber tips and general pieces of information that come in from across the world, and we process them into a form that law enforcement can respond to. So I'm just going to share my screen here, Gigi. You just might want to make sure that this works. So yeah, as I said, the focus of the Australian Centre to Counter Child Exploitation is to free children from sexual exploitation, and it doesn't matter where that child is. We have a global focus. We work with all of our international partners. This is a borderless crime by its very nature, and that requires a borderless response from law enforcement. Many of the people that I work with on a daily basis are scattered across the globe, and I've known them for the entire 20 years that I've been working in this crime type. So some of the topics that Gigi threw in there were looking at risks, and one of the things I want to talk about primarily is applications, because that's really where the danger sits for our kids. They've embraced technology. at a rate that has significantly outstripped their parents. That's just a fact. The latest app, your child has it well in advance of anything that you would know about it. And the reality with apps is that they function without any regulation or governance, and that really is the critical piece of danger here. But when you look at them with respect to our current environment with COVID, many of you that are probably even tuning into this cast would be working from home. And those requirements will be quite demanding for you to try to focus on the core business of delivering whatever service it is that you do while you've got your kids with you. And I expect that will probably mean that many of you will be relaxing the limitations that you would normally have on your kids for internet usage, for devices, and for online gaming. And we know from our experience in criminal investigation that child sex offenders focus on children that are bored or lonely and that have increased spare time. These are all factors that increase the vulnerability of kids from sexual predation. And working from home and social isolation also applies to the child sex offenders. They have plenty of time on their hands as well. And I can tell you for a fact that from what we are seeing and from what we're monitoring on the different online environments, including the darknet and the clearnet, we've seen significant volume increases in activity in communications and the sharing and distribution of abusive images of children. To some extent, we've actually seen sites crash because of the volume. And that shouldn't be a quantum leap for you to think about, because, I mean, how many of you have increased your streaming on Netflix? You know, I don't know, this would be having a global impact on broadband usage because people are isolated and at home and they will turn to technology. Well, the fact is the child sex offenders are, and so are the kids. So that it's not a quantum leap for any of you to think that that's going to increase the level of risk that is posed to kids. We've actually seen dedicated groups that have been set up specifically for COVID, where we see the child sex offenders talking about how they're abusing their kids at home due to school closures. And in some cases, we've seen child sex offenders instructing other members on how to abuse their children at home. So this is happening, and it's a real thing. Now, we're all encountering social distancing. And the reality of that is it's going to increase the likelihood that kids are going to be looking for other opportunities for social interaction, including what they've been doing for many years, which is emulating the viral video trends on apps like TikTok. And once again, this will increase opportunities for exploitation. Now, Kik has been one of the applications that we as law enforcement have monitored for many years. It's been responsible for a lot of the prosecutions and investigations that we've conducted. But kids embrace these viral challenges like the "Am I pretty or ugly?" And these are open source ClearNet grabs that I've taken, where kids are going online and throwing a video out to the world going, "Do you think I'm pretty or I'm ugly?" And I'm sure that you can imagine what kind of responses some of these poor kids are getting in relation to the posts that they've put online. Other ones like the Touch My Body challenge, where kids would blindfold themselves and then grab the person they're with hand and place it on a particular part of their anatomy. Quite a lot of sexual interaction between the kids in some of these videos. And once again, the audience that they're dealing with here, and in many cases they're dealing for likes and followers, contains child sex offenders. So Gigi threw out some of the issues around challenges, and from the victim identification perspective, and what you need to understand about our VID teams is that they're the dedicated members of law enforcement teams that focus their efforts on examining content that comes from either our digital seizures from our arrests and our prosecutions, or they actually scour the ClearNet and the darknet looking for new content. And their sole responsibility is to locate the children that are depicted in the images and videos. And we know for a fact from the content that we're dealing with now that about 70% of the new material we're seeing is self-produced. material like some of the videos that I just showed you a moment ago. And we can't ignore that. The reality is that those children are putting themselves at significant risk, but I also haven't shown you some of the video content that we've seen kids produce. And one of the ones that strikes me that I won't show you, and I can't, was a girl who was about 13 years of age. It's a Skype video feed. We're looking from the offender's point of view. The child is crying as the video starts and the offender commences, and she's located in her house. You can clearly see that. At one point you hear her mother call out to her. And over 37 minutes, he instructs her to violate herself in some quite horrendous ways that the offender captured and videoed. That's a lot of the content that we're seeing. And it's because children are embracing these apps, looking for followers, accepting friend requests from people that they don't know, and then putting themselves into a situation where they are vulnerable and susceptible to sexploitation, that this is happening. And it's happening right under the nose of their parents. So the simple message from us that we've been trying to push out for quite some time is that, once an image or a video has been sent or distributed, the control is gone. You've lost it. The child is vulnerable to sexploitation and cyberbullying. And in some jurisdictions, the reality is they have committed potentially a criminal offence by producing and distributing child abuse material. Now, there's parameters around that. So let me be clear, we're not here to prosecute children for innocent exploration amongst themselves. But it's important that they understand the consequences of putting this content online and losing control of it. The other thing is that this does is that it's diverting the very finite resources that we as law enforcement have. We are a very stretched blue line, and we can't ignore what's happening to these kids. And the reality is that there are serious consequences that can come from their behaviour, as evidenced by the tragedy 8 years ago now of Amanda Todd, where she took her own life as a result of something that she did online that went viral, and she was cyberbullied. And I had the great honour and pleasure of meeting her mum at the Florida conference that was hosted by a good friend of ours, Mike Duffy, in December. A very brave woman trying to get this message out to parents on the back of the tragic loss of her daughter. So Neil mentioned this issue around education and awareness, and these are just a couple of links from the Australian context. We have the Think You Know program, which is run by the Australian Federal Police in partnership with state and territory agencies. And we also have Julie Inman Grant, who was the Children's Commissioner for Australia. The safety site has got some excellent resources that you might want to look at. Particularly, there's some components there that are focused on how to look after your kids during this particular situation that we face globally at the moment with COVID. So Gigi in his flyer mentioned detection, and we are proactive in that space. Despite COVID, we are working every day. We are effecting the arrests of offenders and distributing leads across the world. Our resources are focused across a broad spectrum of the internet, darknet, clearnet, mobile apps, file sharing. And we also respond reactively to a lot of leads that come in from the public and a lot of cyber tips that come in from the National Centre for Missing Children in Washington, DC. I think last year or the year before, it was around 18 million cyber tips were distributed globally. In Australia, we don't get an enormous volume of cyber tips, but at this stage in this financial year, we're sitting at about 13,200 cyber tips, which is quite significant, particularly when you take into context what a cyber tip can potentially mean. So as an example, in 2017, we received a cyber tip that related to an entity that was purporting to be Justin Bieber, that had engaged an 11-year-old child in the US and had sent the child 3 child abuse images. The offender, as it turned out, was utilising a multitude of applications, and I go back to that point about the danger of applications, including one that was Musical.ly but is now TikTok. Ultimately, our investigation of that individual from that cyber tip led to the arrest of an individual here in Queensland on over 900 charges. And he had, we calculated, around 157 child victims globally. And in each instance, he did exactly what I described to you before, where he would seduce the children into believing he was Justin Bieber, and he would then turn the conversation into sexualized chat. He would capture what the children did to themselves with the promise of a backstage pass or concert tickets. And the children were then effectively trapped by this individual. This happens pretty much every single day, and it forms part of a lot of the cyber tips that we are receiving, which is the important message that we're trying to get across to you here, I guess, tonight, is about online safety, particularly at a time when we have such a high proportion of the population utilizing the internet, both for good and tragically for evil. So there's another player in all of this, and I'm just going to mention it briefly, and this is around the issue of the industry's role in all of this and the arguments around privacy. So something I'd like to pose to you as the audience is the corporate responsibility that the people who create these applications and the technology that we're using to even communicate right now. At what point does ensuring that a communication platform is safe and not used to commit criminal acts against children get outweighed by a user's right to privacy? And you'll be aware that this is something that we're facing globally at the moment as applications like Facebook move towards encrypting their communication platforms. And what that means for us as law enforcement is that cyber tip that I just described to you a moment ago about Justin Bieber would never have come to us. And that offender would continue to exploit children globally on that application and with pretty much immunity. So that's something I just want to throw out there as a conversation piece. We have the resources to investigate these crimes, and the reality is that it's just not a level playing field at any given time for us. So applications and the industry have a role and a responsibility just as much as parents, carers, guardians, and law enforcement and governments have to protect children. So I'm just throwing that out there. You know, we are confronted by a range of things across borders: capability, legislation, MLAT, encryption. All of these things are something that we take on every single day and investigate, and we save children. But I throw the challenge back out to industry to step up to the mark and start taking some strong responsibility for the way that your applications are used, and to make sure that you're doing your best to also make sure that, particularly now while we're in this horrendous situation that the world faces, that the internet is a safe place for kids. So with that, Gigi, I'll finish my component and throw back to you.
Gigi, you've got your mute on, mate.
There we go. John, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your presentation. You know, we've been on this training for a long time, and you've been really advocate of what we do at the International Center for Missing Children. So thank you so much for your time. With that said, Ramanjot, the floor is yours. And again, thank you so much for everyone. Keep throwing the questions on the Q&A section. I am writing some of the questions down, and then we'll try to address them at the end. Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Ramanjit.
Hello. Okay, so it looks like it's working. I do have a presentation, so I'm going to share my screen. Let's see if I can make this work. Perfect. Okay. Okay, I'm hoping that's working. Okay. All right, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, good evening. My name is Ramin. I am going to be talking about how we can protect our children during the pandemic, kind of just taking over what John and Neil has said, and I'm going to try to bring in a more mental health perspective. Let's get to it. A little bit about myself. So I'm actually a licensed mental health counselor in the state of Washington, and currently I'm in Seattle, and it's 7 a.m. here, so it's bright and early. I got my master's from Monash University, Australia, and I'm currently pursuing my PhD in clinical psychology. I work a lot with survivors of human trafficking and child sexual abuse online, and I specialize in a lot of trauma-focused therapies. So that's just a little bit about me. So let's get into it. So this pandemic has definitely changed all of our lives. And due to the nature of the virus, most schools around the world are closed, and so are many other important agencies. People are required or even requested to stay at home. And everywhere, we go on the internet, we go anywhere, everyone's just like, stay at home, save lives. But we forget that home is not safe for everyone, especially a lot of kids. We know that not a lot of kids have a safe home. There are children who live with abusive parents or guardians, and for some children, school is actually the only break that they get from their abusive life. So with no school and support from faculty and peers, these kids are stuck at home with their abusers, which is very concerning. So yeah, these kids definitely are a very vulnerable population. They become easy targets to physical, mental, and emotional abuse. They go through a lot of neglect. I think it's important to remember that a lot of the kids around the world, they depend on school for important resources like food. So with schools being closed right now, there is, they're easy targets of neglect. And of course, online grooming, in-person grooming, child sexual abuse online, and even trafficking. So these kids definitely are a very vulnerable population right now. Okay, and because schools are now closed, kids are also less visible. A lot of kids right now do not have access to their safe adults, and some safe adults, what I mean by that is like school counselors, teachers, social workers. Kids right now do not have access to a lot of them. And with no in-person contact, it is also very difficult for other adults to pick up on signs of neglect and abuse and to report that. And of course, with increased financial stress, health, food stress, a lot of kids do also become sort of like the projection of all the stress from their parents. This again increases the vulnerability, and it also increases sex labor and trafficking. To the pandemic and mental health, like I mentioned earlier, I think we'll all agree that this has left us feeling quite anxious and depressed, and it's a very confusing time, especially for children. It's important to remember that not a lot of children might really understand what's going on. It's definitely a very confusing time for them. And with less face-to-face contact with their peers and with less access to outside resources, these kids are actually quite desperate for attention. And of course, they're turning to social media websites and gaming apps to seek that interaction and attention. And of course, feeling trapped and bored at home can leave them very, very vulnerable, making them easy targets to online grooming and in-person grooming. Perpetrators during the pandemic, I think Neil, John or Neil, I think you both might have mentioned this, that during this time, it's important to remember that the perpetrators actually have a lot of time as well. So they are now, they're going to be viewing a lot more child sexual abuse online. They'll be distributing a lot of those videos. They have a lot more time to groom kids, and it gives them the opportunity to also engage in more hands-on abuse. So yeah, the perpetrators right now know that kids are home and that kids also don't have access to those safe adults, for guidance. And I think another thing to remember is that the pandemic can also trigger the perpetrator's traumas and stress, and that they are more likely to act on their addiction to gain some kind of power and control. So yeah, so perpetrators are more likely to offend at this time, kind of like what John mentioned. There's a spike in all of this already. So keeping that in mind is very important. Online grooming, I just want to quickly talk about, what that actually means. So during online grooming, a perpetrator can pretend to be another child. They can make a fake profile on the gaming apps or social media, and they work on building trust with kids. They will give them undivided attention and a lot of compliments, and because they have so much time right now, they can definitely do that. And they might send them sexually explicit images, or they'll start flashing kids on the webcams, and then they expose them to pornography without consent. And of course, after building trust, they can lure kids into sending sexually explicit photos and videos of themselves, which leads to blackmail. And again, it just creates this cycle of abuse. So that's kind of just in a nutshell what online grooming could look like. Here, I just wanted to also talk about some signs to look for online grooming. There are many behavioral changes in kids that happen when they're being groomed online. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And I think the number one red flag is that kids start becoming very secretive with their devices. You'll notice that they're always locking themselves in their bedrooms, or they're changing their screens as soon as you approach them. So if you sit next to them, they'll change their phone screen or their computer tab. They'll be wanting to spend a lot of their technology time in their rooms. You'll also notice a lot of mood swings and some irritability, especially if you try to set limits on technology time. So there's a lot of mood swings and irritability. You might also notice changes in their appearances. So they might start dressing up a little bit more explicitly. They might start talking about a new friend without a lot of details, and they'll start spending less time with their old friends. They might start lose interest in schoolwork. There are visible changes in their eating and sleeping patterns, and grooming can also trigger self-harm, because it brings up a lot of feelings of confusion, shame, and guilt. So these are just some signs to look for. The pandemic and post-traumatic stress disorder, I just wanted to quickly talk about that as well. So during this pandemic, I think it is also important to talk about some of the survivors of sexual exploitation. And many of the survivors that I work with have reported that the pandemic has left them feeling, it's triggered their PTSD. It's triggering their trauma symptoms. A lot of the survivors are reporting, that they're feeling trapped, because they're being told that they cannot leave the house. So it's bringing up a lot of their memories from when they were being abused, and they feel like they really don't have a control of their life. It's bringing up, feelings of disassociation, which basically means kind of reliving the same memories over and over. It's bringing up nightmares and flashbacks from their abuse. And a survivor said that it's also making them feel very uncertain, because during their abuse, they didn't know. There was this uncertainty how long this abuse would last, which kind of like what's happening right now. There's this uncertainty. We don't really know how long this will last. So all of this is bringing up feelings of suicide and self-harm. So I just wanted to put that out there because I think it's very important to check in with these very brave survivors and to reach out to them and to support them during this very difficult time. Currently in the news, so more and more states, especially in America at least, they're all of them are reporting a huge they're reporting a concern about the overall decrease in mandated reporting, especially because schools are closed and schools are number one resources for all these reports. So that's definitely concerning. And due to the nature of the virus, most states are asking their child welfare workers to avoid in-person contact, which takes away that opportunity to have that direct contact with kids and to pick up on signs of signs of abuse and neglect. So this decrease is definitely very, very concerning. So what can we do? I think, so I was just thinking of a couple of ideas, and I hope that a lot of schools have made their school counselors available online. I think that would be very helpful, kind of like what John and Neil mentioned, just putting out resources so that these, so kids can reach out, sending helpline numbers, that would be very helpful, and having educational webinars with parents. I think that would be great. I think Neil said that, kind of like helping parents to learn that language about consent and how to teach kids about consent and grooming, because there are parents who's out there who still don't think this exists, and it's very scary. And I hope that we can have, we can put out these resources and we can have more educational webinars, especially during this time, when kids are home, parents are home, these conversations can start. And I hope that really happens. And of course, always providing early interventions to grooming and all these other things. And checking in with the survivors is also very essential. And hopefully, having webinars like this can also help just start the conversation. And I think that's all I have. This was a quick presentation, but it kind of gives us more time for questions. So Gigi, I'm just going to let you take over. Here we go. Did that work? Yes.
Thank you so much, Raman.
Of course.
I appreciate your presentation. Well, thank you, everyone. There has been a really, really interesting questions. We have about 12 minutes to address some of these questions. Of course, I won't be able to get to all of them. However, our website, icmec.org, ICMEC, please get a hold of us. I'll be happy to put you in contact with some of the speakers as well. Again, that is www.icmec.org. And there's got to be a way that you can get a hold of us so we can put you in contact with the speakers. So with that said, Neil, the first question is going to go to you. And the question goes, Neil, what is UNODC doing with refugees or asylum seekers during this time around COVID and around with sexual exploitation? Are there any resources, or what are the local offices doing about it?
That's a great question. Thank you for that. And I've been scrolling through the questions as well, whilst the others have been talking, trying to throw some answers down there. To give you a sense, we've got, I think, 68 questions so far, so we're doing all right. What are we doing at UNODC? So at UNODC, we have 81 field offices around the world. And what we've done since the pandemic kicked off is making sure that we're reaching out to our partners in policing, in criminal justice, and in government to help identify those areas where kids are at most risk during this time. So it's not just a UNODC solution either. We work across the entire United Nations family. So we have the High Commission on Refugees, and we have other bits of the organization who are present through our resident coordinators around the world. So the sort of conversations that we're having now, we're having that internally within the UN as well. And just earlier this week, I mean, it's like the rest of you, every day plans into every other day. I spoke to, I think, 3,000 of our staff around the world explaining these sorts of issues. So that helps us to get this knowledge, this cognizance of threat and how it presents itself. And I really want to pay tribute to John and Raman for what they have said. This helps all of us to understand what this looks like and the sort of experiences that these guys have had in their careers. And you've seen John with 36 years as a cop and 20 years doing this. It is pernicious. It stays in your head for the rest of your life. And what they do is take those risks and pass that on to people that are engaging with the refugee communities, with those who are in, for example, held in refugee camps, to understand what the threat looks like and how to respond to it. So it is a whole of UN, whole of government response, and it's across NGOs like Save the Children and lots of others as well.
Thank you, Neil. The second question, of course, Neil, I'm going to give three questions. You have mentioned pain to watch online events. Some of them include sexual exploitations. Is the UNODC doing any way to work with industry to track this, to train law enforcement, or to interact with some of these stakeholders?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. It's a core part of what we do. And offenders often believe that when they pay per view or when they're operating online, that they are anonymous, that they can't be found. The work that we do with law enforcers around the world, the work that people like John and his teams do, totally disprove this myth. If you conduct child sexual abuse online, the likelihood of you getting a knock on the door from policing, irrespective of where you live, is exceptionally high. You will be detected and you will be brought to justice. And the way that we do this at UNODC is we deliver training to cops and prosecutors, especially on using digital forensic evidence, on tracking and tracing cryptocurrencies. So when you think you're operating with immunity with that, you're not, and helping to bring offenders to justice. And there's lots of ways and techniques that we can do that. And sometimes when we speak with offenders or speak with policing who are dealing with offenders, the offenders thought, well, hey, I was speaking to a child online. You might be speaking with an undercover police officer. So it's about raising that risk that offenders who seek to operate online never know that moment when they're actually maybe engaging with a cop and not engaging with the child. So there are all of those intervention opportunities. If this is the sort of thing that you do, then there are those opportunities to stop, to step back and think about what you do, because the technology, the capability, the legislation is there to track people down and to bring them with proportionality, legality, accountability, and necessity to justice.
Okay, and the last question, Neil. The Five Eyes are doing a lot of work around online child sexual exploitation. What is the EC doing about the problem?
So the Five Eyes are, it's an acronym used to describe the governments of Australia, Canada, UK, US, and New Zealand, and the EC is the European Community. I'm going to give the very UN answer is you'd have to ask them because I don't speak on their behalf. But what I can say more broadly is that governments around the world are working to counter this. There are working groups between law enforcement. If I look at my previous career within Europol, the EU's law enforcement agency, the work that they do now within the European Cybercrime Centre, within Interpol by bringing their child sexual abuse database to the fore, and we help to enable that. With NGOs like the Child Rescue Coalition, the Internet Watch Foundation. John mentioned the E-Safety Commissioner's Office in Australia. There are so many different organizations working locally, nationally, regionally, and internationally to bring their unique skill sets to try and counter this. Our role, my role as a diplomat, is to make sure that they are doing this, to help to create the opportunities for them to do this. And when Nayeli is speaking in the Spanish session, what she and you guys, so Gigi, Pili, what you've done is help us to bring people together, to help bring governments together, to build the opportunities, the legislation, the operational commitment to do something about this. And like I've said before, there is no single solution to this. There is no single law enforcement solution to this. But by having conversations like these, where it's not a taboo, where we can openly talk about this, then that's a hell of a start.
You know, I always say it's all about partnerships, and I believe the partnership that we have with you guys is tremendous, and I think we're making a tremendous mark. Thank you so much, Neil, for your time.
Welcome.
I'm going to go with John. I'm going to give you 3 sets of questions, John. The first one is, what are you guys doing about prosecuting child sex offenders?
What a great question. Yeah, well, we prosecute a lot of child sex offenders. That's our job, and we prosecute child sex offenders globally. So, you know, those cyber tips that come into our country, each and every one of those is triaged, processed, and value added here at the ACE, and then sent out as an investigative lead to any of the agencies or state and territory partners across Australia. I think while in the time I was at Argos, you know, we generated several thousand proactive investigative leads that we sent globally every year. So just rest assured that there is globally a very comprehensive, coordinated and networked law enforcement response. that can get cases across the globe and actioned within, in many cases, within 24 hours. And that's so important because, you know, our COVID online teams and our VID teams are in many cases seeing sexual abuse that's happened within hours. And if we don't act in a timely manner and get it to one of our partners to be actioned, triaged and processed quickly, that sexual abuse continues to happen. Very sadly, I've seen many cases in my time in this crime type where, you know, it's taken us months and months and months of work to try to find the children. And we know for a fact in one case in the US, this particular little girl was sexually abused the night before the FBI went through the door. So I guess in short, in answer to the question, just rest assured we're doing our bit. We really are.
All right, thank you, John. And I want to put the other two questions together. How is this affecting teens? And what about video games? What kind of environment? What are you guys doing proactively to target video games?
Okay, so how's this affecting teens? You've seen that. If you watch that presentation I just did, that's how it's affecting them. You know, I'm not a child psychologist. That's not my skill set, but I am a parent. I've raised a child, a girl who's now, you know, she's 25, pride and joy of my life. So I know the impacts that even, for example, cyberbullying can have on children. They don't have the cognitive abilities to deal with these issues. So we've got a whole generation of kids right now that are influenced by the Kardashians. You know, they think that that's real. They think that that's normal life. They're influenced by the influencers on Instagram, and they think that that's real and that's normal life, and they want to be those people. So that's the way that the internet is affecting our children, and it leaves them so incredibly vulnerable to exploitation. With respect to video games, look, that's a very challenging area for law enforcement to proactively investigate, but I can assure you that we're aware of the communication platforms that the gamers sit on while they're waiting to go in to the game or even while they're playing. We get a lot of intelligence from other gamers that comes through to our triage unit here in Brisbane. And we also have a very good relationship with those gaming application moderators that allows the free flow of that intelligence to us. Again, it is a very challenging environment. The sexual exploitation, particularly of young boys on gaming platforms, has been around since gaming platforms existed on the internet. So it's just one more area that, you know, as a parent, if you're going to let your kid play, you know, Call of Duty, whatever version it is, just be aware that they might not just be talking to other young boys or young girls, okay? There's a lot of people have a different reason for playing online games, and that's to gain access to your kids. Thank you so much, John, as always. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to move to the last set of questions with Raman. Ramanjat, when you said you were working with human trafficking, victims of human trafficking, has COVID-19 affected this work? What are you seeing, or what kind of trends are you seeing in some of those victims of trafficking?
Thanks, Gigi. Okay. So right now, I think so. I haven't had any new patients or clients in a while because we've been closed. Sorry, our agency is closed. But I've been working with the survivors that I was working with earlier, and we've been using a lot of telehealth because our agency is closed. The clinic has been closed. So which is also very concerning because we're not doing, we're not taking in a lot of new people right now. So there's definitely an increase. There's a hold on a number of intakes that we're doing, which hopefully I'm hoping that will change next week. But yeah, there's definitely been an increase in anxiety, a lot of trauma is being triggered. And like, I think I also mentioned in my presentation, there's a lot of, the feeling of uncertainty, and this, a lot of people are reporting that they feel like that life is a little bit out of control. And it's just a hard time for a lot of these survivors. Yeah.
All right, thank you. And I want to put the last two questions together because we need to wrap this up.
Yeah.
So considering the potential massive growth with COVID and victims, are you seeing any additional new trends? Do you have any samples of victim behaviors or any citations of these? And are there best practices or guidelines?
Well, I think kind of John also mentioned that, there is an increase in, we're all watching Netflix, we're all binging on the internet. And so there's definitely an increase in the amount of, social media time that kids are, kids are, gaming a lot more. They're spending a lot more time on the social media, and we all already know how social media affects our mental health. So now they're a lot more exposed to, all day they're exposed to the Kardashians, or they're all day, talking to strangers, and they're going to be invested in making new friends online because they have time. Yeah. So, I was just reading through the comments, Gigi, and a lot of people were asking for some resources, and so I just wanted to quickly mention that. And I think there's several crisis helplines out there that people can use. There's also, you can go on apa.org, that's you can get a lot of good resources from there. I know Psychology Today is what we use in America if you want to find a mental health professional. And right now, a lot of mental health professionals are doing telehealth, and the state of Washington at least has kind of loosen their guidelines with telehealth, and that so people have more access. So please just reach out. I know it's a very hard time, especially mental health wise, so just please reach out for help. Reach out to mental health counselors and professionals, and talk and start a dialogue. Start talking to your kids, start having these conversations where you can openly, kind of like what Neil said, where you can openly use words like, sexual exploitation, grooming, let's have these conversations. That's where it starts.
Well, thank you so much, Roman. Just to really close the webinar, I want to thank the panelists. Thank you so much for your presentations. We value your feedback. And again, we continue to work with you on more activities and more events. Just on a final note, as I said, the International Center for Missing Children does have a lot of resources as well. So I encourage all the participants to log into our website. There's an education portal for teachers and educators, mental health, and so on. We have an international law enforcement training where we train law enforcement all over the world. We have multidisciplinary trainings. The resources are there. Go onto the website. Lastly, there was a question on best practices, and John had also mentioned the e-safety commissioner run by Julie Inman Grant, which she's a great friend. But the e-safety commissioner has published best practices and guidelines. If you go to the website, you can download that information as well for those of you who are in the audience. So look, go into it and get the best practices. And again, I want to say thank you. Thank you for the participants. We ran 2 minutes over time, but I appreciate your time. And if you have any questions, please go to our website to get more information, or at least you can get a hold of one of us. So anyway, thank you. This concludes the webinar. And thank you so much for all our partners who helped us distribute information on this webinar. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day, evening.